As we continue our series in Foundations that Make for a Healthy Society, Joseph becomes second in command in Egypt. We have been pursuing this story, and we're in Genesis chapter 41, verses 38 through 57. And Pharaoh looks for the right person to manage the prediction of his dream. That's where we were when we left off last week. Chapter 41, verse 38. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man?" This is after Joseph had interpreted Pharaoh's dreams by the grace of God. "One in whom is the Spirit of God." One of the things that was recognized, even though Pharaoh was not a worshiper of God, he recognized something of the Spirit of God. And you know, when your life is that way, others recognize the Spirit of God in you and recognize that God is at work in you. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all of my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So he was right next to the king in all of Egypt, to the Pharaoh in all of Egypt. Joseph then became in charge of all of Egypt with the exception of Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one discerning and as wise as you, and you shall be in charge of my palace, and my people are to submit to your orders. And again, only with respect to you will I be greater." Bible Knowledge Commentary says God's revelation demanded a response. So Joseph advised Pharaoh to choose a wise man who would oversee storing 20% of the grain during each years of plenty, for the coming years of famine. That would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Wisdom literature teaches that wisely planning ahead is a basic principle of practical living. Things like savings, things like planning ahead and planning for the future. Joseph is honored by Pharaoh and therefore honored by God. So when Pharaoh was honoring Joseph, it took Joseph out of prison, and it was God's way of honoring Joseph as well. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command. And people shouted before him, "Make way." Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Now, here's the question. We don't know what record we have of this in history, because it's not a usual thing for a pharaoh to record all of that, but God records it for us in history, and the Jewish lineage and the Jewish families all recorded it because it was a story that was passed down, and under inspiration of God, Moses recorded it, and it was deemed to be an accurate story. So you can trust the Word of God. Joseph has the power as that second in command. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name, and this is a hard name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Now it's interesting, because if he had been back in Israel, they would have been very, very cautious about him taking a wife from the nation of Israel. But political marriages happened often in these times, and you didn't refuse the Pharaoh if he was going to give you a wife. So that was one of those things that was a little bit of a compromise, and wasn't part of God's ideal, but it was part of what had to happen in that political situation. If you look at Solomon, most of Solomon's marriages, whether they were good or bad, were political marriages for the sake of the political situation. Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt because he wanted to survey it. He wanted to visit it. The signet ring Pharaoh gave Joseph was a ring with a seal used for signing documents. When the seal was impressed on the soft clay document, which then hardened, it left an indelible impression of the ruler's seal, and so carried his authority. Pharaoh also dressed Joseph in linen cloths and a gold neck chain, made him second in command to Pharaoh, and had him ride in his second chariot so that all the people could do homage to him. So he was getting respect that he never got in prison. It continues. As a token of Joseph's new status, Pharaoh gave him a wife, Asenath, from the priestly family of On, a city which was the center of sun worship 7 miles north of Cairo, and also known as Heliopolis. He also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, and there was the name. Joseph was 30 years old at the time of this installment. A lot of power for a 30-year-old, a lot of responsibility. How many 30-year-olds do you know today who could handle that kind of responsibility? Very, very few in our society. There are a few. 13 years after he was sold by his brothers. Okay, so Joseph's position, now he's going to be another 14 years with the feast and the famine, so he's going to be 47 by the time, 44 by the time that all of this is done. Joseph's position gave him opportunity to travel extensively across Egypt. Joseph was only 30, as I said, when God used him to deliver this nation and his own nation. Oops, why did I do that? Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service, verse 46 said, of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled through Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plenty. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sands of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. So they had a great abundance in that 7 years. That was good planning. And Joseph's family and the 7 years of abundance. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and you're going to see this in Jewish history, and said, "It is because God has made me forget all of my troubles and all of my father's household." What was Joseph saying? He's saying, I spent those years in prison, many years in prison, and I was treated badly by my father's household, by my brothers, and yet God has given me Manasseh, and the name means he helped me forget all of my troubles because he's put me in a different position now. The second son, he named Ephraim, and he said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. He went from prison to tremendous fruitfulness, but that was all part of God's purpose. Do you know that's what God does in your life and my life? He doesn't make us fruitful just to make us fruitful for selfish reasons. He doesn't make us fruitful just to use it on ourselves. He makes us fruitful so that we can bless others. The book of 1 Peter says that we are to be a blessing so that we can bless others. And that's exactly what God was doing. So your life in Jesus Christ is designed to bless others. It's not designed just to bless you. Now, will you get a blessing because of that? Absolutely. But it's designed to bless and benefit others, and that's exactly what Joseph was doing. The Bible Knowledge Commentary again says, in spite of his success, he did not abandon his Israelite heritage. He gave his two sons characteristically Hebrew names. He didn't give them Egyptian names. Manasseh, forget, signified that God had made him forget the misery of his separation from his family. And Ephraim, fruitful, signified that God had made him fruitful in the land of Egypt. The end of the 7 years of abundance and the beginning of this severe famine was about to start. In verse 53, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was a famine in all the other lands as well, including Israel. But in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. Pharaoh trusted Joseph, God trusted Joseph, and Joseph trusted God. The second 7 years of famine, Joseph would be 44 by the end of the time, by that end of that famine. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere else, including Israel. A summary of this story from the Psalms, because this was so significant in history. What Joseph accomplished, what God was doing in Joseph, was so significant that the psalmist recorded it. And Israel recited it over and over to remind them of this. Psalm 105, verse 16. It says, he called down famine on the land, talking about God, and destroyed all their supplies of food. And he sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. This is what they would rehearse in their Israeli history. They bruised his feet with shackles, that was the imprisonment. His neck was put in irons, till what he foretold came to pass. That's the dreams. Till the word of the Lord proved him true. Isn't that a nice place to be in life? When the word of the Lord proves you true because you've been true and honest before the Lord. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the peoples set him free. And this was what they would say. He made him master of his household, ruled over all he possessed, to instruct his princes as he pleased and teach his elders wisdom. Then Israel entered Egypt. Now this is the history that we haven't covered yet. When the brothers and when all the family of Israel come down, and then it begins the part for the Exodus that Moses writes about when they're in slavery for 400 years and they forget Joseph. Jacob resided as a foreigner in the land of Ham. Now the land of Ham is talking about down there in Egypt. The Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them too numerous for their foes, whose hearts he turned to hate his people, to conspire against his servants. He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen, and they performed his signs among them, his wonders in the land of Ham. So this psalm is connecting. This is what they would recite, and this is what they would have their children memorize, and this is what they would talk about in their history and their culture. So here's the question. What do you talk about in your Christian history? What do you talk about in your Christian culture? What do you tell your children and your grandchildren about the stories of God's faithfulness, not only in your life, but the stories from Scripture? That's what the ancient Israelites did. Now, I want to give you a couple of principles just in wrapping up. God can honor and bless those who honor and bless God's people. That's what Joseph did, and that's also what Pharaoh accomplished. No bad thing will last forever. No bad thing will last forever. The world turns beauty into ashes, and God turns ashes into beauty.